Welcome everybody to Simon Says for another year. So starting with an interesting topic this time in the mind-body problem. And so this is more commonly known as what is consciousness or where is consciousness in the brain? And so some people have brains that look a bit like this, others have brains full of different things, but scientists are still struggling to work out what makes you in your mind, in your brain, where are you? And so let's have a look at where we're at the moment, and that might even cross over with some philosophy as well as we go. So we'll start with what is the mind-body problem. So that's a good place to start. And then we'll have a look at the different ways that we study consciousness, whether we can do it directly through subjective experience or correlation of brain activity and a stimulus. Then we'll look at some neurobiological theory, how the brain processes stimulus, what the Bible has to say about all this, and maybe does the whole universe have a consciousness? All right, so what is the mind-body problem? So it started, well, I don't know if it started, but the idea in terms of that phrase was helped to popularize by Nagel's book in 1987. What does it all mean? A very short introduction to philosophy. And so it's only a small chapter in the book, but there's a lot there. I had a read of it, and every paragraph it's like mind blown. And it brought a very they're very simple ideas, but they make you think. So in terms of it talked about the idea of consciousness happening, because the mind-body problem is to do with where is consciousness in the brain? Is it just the brain buzzing and doing stuff, or is it something in of itself and separate? And so I talked about the idea that we have consciousness, and it has links to our body, of course, because if I kick my toe on something, I feel pain, and I get a bit upset about it. So there's been nerves sending that signal to my brain, and then my brain's doing something about it. And so for me to be aware of that in my consciousness, my brain needs to play a role as well. And so that kind of makes sense. If you kick a toe and some nerves happen, then ouch, okay, that makes sense. But what about thoughts? What about the stuff that's only happening here? You know, if I'm having a thought, if I'm like, well, maybe not hungry right now, but I'm like, I wonder if the Broncos are going to win on the weekend. That's just something that's happening in my brain. That's not linked to any of my senses. That's different again. And so we presume, you know, as scientists, doctors, and so on, that this has something to do with all those neurons firing in your brain, because we see that there's a lot of neurons in there. We know that the brains do these things, and we can see it happening in real time with machines like MRI these days. And so that makes sense. You know, there's thoughts in here. There's my neurons doing their thing, but there's still a question is because we can't separate the neurons from the thoughts. We can't look at them in isolation. I can't look at a thought in a test tube. And so we come across this key problem, which is my mind connected to my brain, or is the brain my mind? Like, is there a mental entity of some sort that can survive and live without a brain? So if I was to go into the afterlife, I can still think, I can still have thoughts, even though my physical brain might be rotting in the ground. And so this mind-body problem talks about, are those things separate? Can we look at them differently? And if we could, or how do we even tell? How do we even work out what that stuff is? Are our feelings and thoughts, are they just these physical zaps inside my brain, or is there more to it? Is there some kind of mental entity? And so the problem with this is that as scientists, we like to observe and repeat things. But the problem is when we have an experience that's in our minds, and we can't directly observe an experience. Two people can watch the same TV show and get different things out of it. They might love it, they might hate it. So when they're exposed to that same stimulus, they're having a different experience because of what's happening in their minds. And I can't just open a little door in your head and look at your mind and experience that. Even if I probe your brain and look at all the signals, I still can't understand and experience what you're experiencing. And so it becomes really problematic for scientists who like to be able to see things and measure them nicely, because you just can't do it, at least not with our current technology. And so let's just say, for argument's sake, that the consciousness is more than just those neurons in your brain. That has its own separate set of things to consider. But for argument's sake, we call this idea dualism. So the fact that there's a brain, but there's also a mental me. They're separate things. So two things, dualism. And so I've got my neurons in my brain. There's a physical component, and then there's the mental component called the soul, which is just me. Whereas if you subscribe to the alternate, where the only thing that's going on is just some zapping in my brain, physical processes only. This is called materialism or physicalism, because all that's there is that physical thing we can look at and touch. All right, so that's kind of a popular way of looking at this. Another one that I found was David Chalmers. So he's done an interesting TED talk on this called How Do We Explain Consciousness? And so his was a little bit more in terms of, it got a little bit more philosophical, I guess, in terms of how do we even go about the consciousness problem? How should we even look at it before we start devoting a lot of resources to it? Like we've noted before, consciousness is subjective and science can only comment on the objective. These things don't line up. And so, for example, psychologists try to describe this stuff, but psychologists study only behavior. They watch what people do and try and guess why they do it. Whereas neuroscientists, they study brains, they look at the wrinkly gray matter on the table, and they try and understand by looking at that physical object, that organ. And so we can come up with a lot of correlations. So we can see that when this thing happens, that happens in the brain. So like if I stub my toe, it looks like this on an MRI machine. I can connect those and say those things are correlated, but they are not an explanation. All I'm knowing is that my brain lights up in this way when that thing happens. It doesn't actually tell me how or why or who or where, or a little bit about where. And so we can't describe the experience. We can only correlate certain parts of the brain with certain things happening, but that's about it. That's a bit limited in what we can do with our technology. And so Chalmers kind of thinks beyond this. Okay, so what are the different ways we can approach this given these limitations? And so the first one he thought was like in something in physics. So if we come across some phenomena that we don't know about yet, we try and find a new fundamental building block of nature and a law that describes it. So we know that things fall to the ground. How can we go and find out gravity? What does that look like? Well, we know that these chemical reactions happen. How can we go and find out about the atoms and the elements that make up these reactions? So maybe there's this consciousness object somewhere that we haven't found yet. So we might go looking for that object in order to describe consciousness. And then the second was second idea they had was that consciousness might even be universal. It might be, shared amongst all things or experienced in a certain way. So whether you're a human or a small animal or even an individual atomic particle. So this is called panpsychism, I guess is how you say it. So this has some similarities to Buddhism. But Buddhism only ascribes consciousness to life. So like all the living things in the universe have a consciousness, they're connected in some way. But this goes beyond that. I think even atoms have a consciousness. Literally everything is connected in some way. And so there's a guy called Tononi who's popularized a theory about this called, I think it's information integration theory, something like that. And so he talks about that, he talks about degrees of consciousness essentially as being pieces of information. So it's almost like looking at things like a computer. So if I'm an atom, I've got a certain position, I've got certain properties and characteristics, I can describe those and they might be viewed out as consciousness. Whereas a person, I have all those things, I have these characteristics, but I also have these connections, these pathways happening. And so I might have a higher degree of consciousness because I've got more of that information transfer happening. And so that's an interesting idea that I'm going to touch on a little bit later. And so Chalmers is talking about the idea that, okay, we can correlate stuff, we can look at things, but that's not really going to get to the core of things. We either need to discover something new, some fundamental building block, or consider that everything is connected and everything has some level of consciousness, whether it's an atom, even though that might look a bit different now, the consciousness in the human brain. And so some of these thoughts, as they go into different, branches of philosophy, it brings up some ethical issues. So do vegans have to starve now? Do plants have consciousness? Should I stop eating them because I'm hurting them? Or if I develop an advanced computer or an artificial intelligence, do I have the right to turn it off? Is it consciousness? Am I ceasing life in that? So you can see how that goes down a rabbit hole very quickly. All right, so we talked about different kind of lines of thought in terms of how we can look at consciousness. Let's have a look at the studies and the sciences that actually go about doing this. And so the first one is just really cool, like reading minds. And so I mentioned before that, there's a thing that happens or a stimulus or a thought. We can look at the brain, how it lights up in response. And so you can see here that the example of the stimulus was the witness shouted during the trial. And they got to a really advanced point in the study where they could predict that a brain will light up like this when a person is thinking that phrase. And then they measured an actual person and it looked really close, like the brains lit up in a very similar way to their prediction. And so just by simply looking at correlations, when this happens, and doing it lots of times and lots of complicated combinations, they can actually come to a pretty predictive thing where they can not only think, are you thinking about a banana, but are you thinking that banana is yellow, it's tasty, I want to eat it right now. So it's getting to more complicated ideas. And so there's a point where maybe even just looking at the outside, even just connecting things may give us some kind of deeper understanding just by building up the complexity of that idea. And I've got a link to that study there if you're interested. And so there's another way to look at this, and this is neurobiological theory. So this was based on a paper by Francis Crick. And so yes, this is the Crick, like Watson, Crick, and Franklin. They're the team that discovered the dual helix shape of DNA. And so this was later in his career, and he was kind of thinking that consciousness rather might come in different forms. Maybe it's linked to attention awareness. So is there a difference between me and who I am versus what I'm focused on, what I'm thinking about right now in the front of my brain? And so he looked at the brain processes and how they connect and fit together. And he had a couple of theories and how they linked particularly to our visual consciousness, so what we see, because we're very visually driven as humans. And so he talked about the idea that there might be this very fast form of consciousness, which is rooted in our iconic memory, which is like that photographic memory of you saw. So if you look at something and close your eyes, that's that iconic memory doing that. Or there might be a slower form, which is linked to your visual attention and short-term memory. So being able to recall and store and think and piece things together that way. And maybe my consciousness is just my brain piecing the things together that I've recently looked at, or maybe dredging up some memories to kind of supplement that. And so the way he looked at it, that consciousness has very direct links to our attention and is therefore limited by our working memory, what we can hold at the front, what we're thinking about. Maybe that's just the limit of our consciousness. Maybe there's not much more to it, even though we tend to talk about and measure and study the idea of subconsciousness as well. I don't know, maybe they connect to that. But the problem here is our working memory tends to only last seconds and it can only hold 7 items. And so that's why we're kind of pushing the limits of remembering a phone number. Any more than that, we're generally going to struggle. There's plenty of studies showing that our working memory can only hold so much. But then there's also the idea of, I think it's qualia, I don't even know how to say that word, but that's the idea of if you see something or experience something that I do you even see it and experience it in the same way? Maybe everybody else sees the whole world upside down compared to me, but we wouldn't know because my right side up is what they call upside down. We never know because we can never experience each other's consciousness to know if it's exactly the same. So that's another level of, okay, if we can even study and work out one person's consciousness, is it the same for everyone else as well? And so we run into some problems with this because when we're linking attention to memory, we've got to consider all the processes of the brain, but things get complicated really fast. And so this is only some of the major cortical and subcortical visual areas in the macaque monkey. And so that's a lot of complicated things all broken down into eye movement, motion. Like that's just a monkey and only some of them. Human brains are much more complicated. So to study this stuff and to piece out all those little wiring is it's a big job. And we now know that our brains are quite plastic in that they can model themselves in different ways based on how we use them. They can remodel themselves in different ways coming back from injuries. And so even if we work out these pathways, are they the same in all people all the time? Is that even going to be useful to us? Then there's the idea that, okay, even if I was to work out all those pathways, even if I was to find out where consciousness happens, is the way that I experience reality even consciousness? Because there are some studies finding out that our brains actually don't work the way we think we do in just experiencing life. And so I've got a little graphic at the bottom here. I can see that there's a little picture of a bee or something like that. And there's this little cursor moving around looking at it. And so you can think of this cursor as your line of sight. As you're looking around in the world, well, that's what I'm looking at. And if we look over on the left, if I'm only viewing that little circle, this is what I'm seeing. And it's very hard to understand what's going on. And yet that's basically what our eyes are doing as we look around. And so we don't see or experience what's on the left-hand side. We think of seeing the world around us as more as what's on the right-hand side. And so there's this kind of this theory and idea that our brain's actually doing a lot of piecing together, a lot of smoothing out edges and filling in gaps so that we can have a cohesive overall picture rather than just this bouncy little focus pinpoint of nothingness. And so there's a recent study that suggests our brain basically lives 15 seconds in the past. And this is actually being supported by other studies, strange as it sounds. And so it's the idea that kind of our brain just takes some time to process, fit things together cohesively, smooth it over so that we can interpret the world around us in this manner rather than just the live feed of juddering stimulus. And so that seems a bit strange. But you think about like how you experience something versus when you record something on a photo, you get this, on a phone rather. So it can be a bit wobbly. It can be hard to follow, hard to focus. It's not the same as you sitting there, but the phone is, technically capturing the same thing as what you're seeing. And so that kind of leads the idea that our brain is doing some kind of processing just to make it a bit easier for us to wrap our heads around what's going on. And it's the idea that our brain is kind of based in the past and kind of averages things together and combines them and smooths them out. It's supported by another study on radiologists, which shows that they weren't just influenced by the present image, but also previous images. And so they're looking at a scan, but the conclusion they came to about that scan was different depending on the scans they saw before that. So their brain's thinking back, it's kind of connecting dots, it's kind of coming up with an average, more cohesive whole of what's going on, rather than being hyper-focused on what's right here and right now. And so that kind of makes sense when connected with this other study, but it's like, hang on, if we want our doctors to be making the right decisions, how can we deal with this kind of brain processing bias based on the recent past that it does? And like I mentioned before, our brain might, we've got processing, we've got thinking at the front, but it might also bring some memories to the table as well for thinking back to the past. And so we tend to think of a memory is just a thing that's stored in our brain. I've got a memory in my brain box, I pull it out, here is the memory, I'm looking at the memory, there's the thing. But that's not how it happens. Our brain actually reconstructs memories from smaller pieces. It takes the feelings from here, it takes the senses from there, it takes the visuals from there. And so rather than taking this one cohesive memory, it's actually reconstructing a jigsaw puzzle of that memory. And as we bring together the jigsaw puzzle, we can hit problems if different pieces are introduced. And so there's plenty of research showing that if a witness has seen a crime, but later on they see a news report, that news report memory might add an extra piece to the puzzle. And so what they remember about actually being there may be influenced and changed about what they read about it later, which were things that they did not see. And so witnesses can be a little bit unreliable because of this. And so we kind of think that we remember things exactly as they are, we see things exactly as they are, but maybe we're kind of processing and putting it together from the recent past and also drawing back memories from long ago and piecing that together too to make this mosaic that our brains can even understand in an individual moment. So in summary, we don't know. There's a lot going on, and our technology and our studies have not even come close to cracking it. And so there's just a lot of different thinking, a lot of different theories, a lot of different studies. We're learning lots of things about the brain, how it acts, what it's connected to, lots of things about psychology in terms of how people act, how this is all pieced together. But we still don't really know where you are. There's the whole idea of a subconscious. How does all that fit in things? And even if you are unconscious, your brain is still active, your brain is still doing things. So does that count as a consciousness? What does that look like? So there's a long way to go, and we like to argue about all sorts of things, but the jury is still out in terms of science. We need to do a lot more studying to work out what in the world is actually going on with consciousness. And so with that said, I want to have a look towards now what the Bible says. And so the body talks about the body, the soul, and the spirit. And so I just wanted to go through those in terms of some verses to talk about these. So the body is probably the easiest to understand. That's the physical packaging. That's the thing that's right here. You can touch it, you can feel it. It's a physical object. And so the Bible teaches, we assume that this is animated by the soul. So you think, you move, you do things. It's made up of cells, including your brain cells. So this includes the physical aspect of your brain. And in the body, we're told that Christians will receive new heavenly bodies at the resurrection. So Philippians 3 says, we're citizens of heaven where the Lord lives. We're eagerly waiting for him to return, and he's going to take our weak mortal bodies and change them into glorious bodies like his own, using the same power with which he'll bring everything under his control. So when Jesus resurrected, he had a heavenly body. People didn't recognize him at first, but he was still identifiable as Jesus, but he had this heavenly body, which is a bit different. I'm looking forward to having one of my own because this one's getting a bit old now. So the next one is, what does the Bible say about the soul? And so when we're talking about consciousness, this is what I interpret to be what the Bible would call the soul. And so this is the living animate aspect of life, whether you're a human or an animal. And so this is your mind. This is how you go about things. Your soul animates your body. And in humans, this lives on forever. So it's going to, it occupies this physical body now. But when this physical body dies, this soul will persist. We'll still have this mental aspect of ourself, this essence of who we are, and that will go on into eternity. So this is our intellect, our personality, and what we tend to think of as us, as a person. And so in Deuteronomy, it says, we must love the Lord God with all our heart, our soul, and our strength. So our heart and our feelings, our soul in terms of, I'm thinking I'm submitted to him, and my strength, just doing everything I can. And then Matthew says, so what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? So the idea that we can accumulate things here on earth, but that soul, that personality, that mind that's going to live on. So we need to be forever. And so we need to be thinking really carefully about where that's going to go and what should we be doing about that. Then lastly, there's the spirit. And so the spirit is the aspect of us which relates to God. And so in the case of Christians, we're said to have a living spirit. But those who aren't connected to God, they're said to have a dead spirit or maybe a sleeping spirit, and that's yet to wake when they're connected to God. And so in Colossians, it says you were dead because of your sins and your sinful nature was not yet cut away. Then God made you alive in Christ. He forgave all our sins. Your physical body was alive, but he brings the spirit to life through that forgiveness in Jesus. 1 Corinthians 2 says, people who aren't spiritual can't receive truth from God's spirit. It sounds foolish to them. They can't understand it because they don't have that spiritual living aspects to help them understand things of the spirit. And so some of the Bible can sound a bit like gobbledygook because of that. All right, so that's the Bible say. And I just want to finish with this one a little bit more about Tononi's integrated information theory. And so that was the idea that consciousness was everywhere in the universe. Everything is connected to everything. Everything has some degree of existence, consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And so he kind of had a thought experiment where if there was a light and it was on or off, and it was our job to, work out when the light is on, when the light is off. And so I can look at the light and know if it's on or off. I'm a human and I can see, so that's a pretty easy task. But a photoreceptor diode, just like a little computer sensor, can do the same thing. It can tell you if there's light being shone on or not. And so what makes me more conscious as a human when we can both do that same job? And the reason is that the sensor works only in binary terms, in terms of yes or no, or maybe it can tell us how much light. Maybe it can give us a graduation of that. But as a human, there's more to this. I need to think, what is light? And then I need to process the visual stimuli, what's happening. Then I need to think, is that bright enough to be counted as on? And so I've got these extra processes which are going on. If it was something was different, humans can disagree on things. And so that just shows that there's more information going on. And so under this theory, we'll conclude that a person is more conscious than the sensor because there's more processing going on than yes, no, or a measurement as a number, for example. And so naturally, this lends itself to things like a new age spiritualism where like everything in the universe is connected. The universe is telling me to do this because everything's going this way at the moment. And so that's kind of way of linking science with spirituality. And that's becoming a more popular thing. It's becoming a more popular scientific theory. And this new age spiritualism is becoming more popularized and present throughout our society as well. Is it a thing? I don't know. will it's a way of looking at the world and measuring the world. I don't know if you could prove it as being right or wrong necessarily, at least not with the technology we have. But I did find it interesting that it kind of links with the verse in Colossians in that he is before all things and in him all things hold together. And so sometimes I think about that. I'm like, is God, is his spirit in matter and, how atoms hold together? Is he in those intrinsic natural forces that literally holds the universe together? Is he part of that? Is he what this theory is trying to describe in that he's in and amongst everything? He's omnipresent. And maybe he's that consciousness and everything that they're trying to look at and see. I don't know, but I thought that was an interesting thought to link with to finish. All right, so that's about it. So we've talked about the mind-body problem in terms of consciousness. Where in the world is it? How can we measure a subjective experience? Can we just correlate brain activity with the stimulus? Can we look at brains and their systems? Do brains even work in the way we think we do as a human with the brain when we study that and we find out that our brains actually do strange different things? And then we looked at the Bible, what the Bible had to say, and maybe there is some kind of underlying connecting factor in the universe, whether it's consciousness or whether it's the Lord and his omnipresence. So as always, I've got some references here, so they're all linked out throughout the presentation. So you're most welcome to have a look at those later on if any of these kind of got your creative juices flowing. There is a lot more detail about all of these things. So there's plenty there to keep you busy if you're interested in any of these particular ideas. But as always, thank you for listening. It's great to have you all, and I'll see you all next time.